Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where reality feels like it has been scribbled by a sleep-deprived monk with a shaky quill. You're about to see medieval animals so bizarre, so nonsensical, that you'll swear someone spiked the ink pot with dream dust. This isn't just artists, a medieval mindset painted on parchment, full of myths, morals, and mistakes that somehow shaped how people understood the natural world. And since we're starting with one of the strangest creatures of them all, let's talk about fish with fur. Yes, you heard that right, fish with fur. But before we dive into this surreal sea, let me give you a cheeky warning. You probably won't survive the laughter, the absurdity, and the sheer oddity of what medieval illustrators left behind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to subscribe, because if you don't, tomorrow's story will simply vanish from your feed. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. Drop a comment with your location and local time so we know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine flipping open a grand medieval bestiary that heavy tome monks would illuminate by candlelight, and instead of finding a sleek fish like a trout or a shimmering salmon, you find something that looks more like your neighbor's cat went for a swim and never came back. There it is, painted with care, scales replaced by thick curls of fur, eyes gleaming as if it just leaped off the page to shake water all over the cloister floor. This isn't a joke. Artists in the Middle Ages really did depict creatures like furry fish because they were convinced, or at least deeply amused by the idea, that nature could mix and match features however it pleased. The setup of the myth is simple. People believed some fish literally grew fur. The humor comes naturally. You can almost hear a medieval fisherman shouting, "Quick, grab the comb, we've netted a hairy cod again." Now, here's the flip. These furry fish weren't products of drunken imagination alone. Medieval artists were actually trying to explain something real: frozen rivers, hairy molds, and strange growths on fish skin that looked like coats of fur. When rivers froze, fish pulled up from icy waters would sometimes be coated in filamentous algae or fungal strands that clung to their bodies like rough hair. To the medieval eye, this wasn't slime or rot, it was fur. Proof that nature had played a prank. So, in their books, fish became hairy little beasts, living proof that God had a sense of humor, or perhaps a warning that even the rivers held mysteries too strange to question. Multiple bestiaries from the 12th and 13th centuries recorded descriptions of furred fish or fish that wear coats, tying them to northern waters where monks had little direct observation. Some tales even claimed that the fur was so thick you could shear the fish like a sheep and make gloves out of its pelt. Just imagine showing up to church with mittens stitched from a haddock. Historians still argue whether these descriptions were deliberate satire, monkish jokes scribbled in margins to keep themselves entertained, or whether they were genuine attempts at scientific observation of fungus-covered carp. A peasant's voice slips into the scene. You picture him trudging across the frozen riverbank, hauling up a net, only to find a flopping creature covered in fuzzy strands. He mutters, "By St. Peter's beard, this one looks warmer than me." The mini-pov gives you that immersive moment, a reminder that these weren't abstract drawings, but reflections of people genuinely shocked by nature's oddities. joke 1 lands here. Fish with fur would finally solve the eternal problem of Friday fasting. You wouldn't need butter for your bread. Just squeeze the fish and spread. Joke 2 surfaces a few moments later. Imagine monks writing "This fish requires brushing twice daily" in Latin notes under the illustration. Joke 3 closes the loop in a modern sense. If furry fish were real, pet stores would never sell aquariums. They'd sell tiny hairbrushes instead. The rhythm of myth and truth keeps pulling you along. You laugh at the absurdity, then lean in when the detail feels oddly plausible. And yet, the medieval logic remains strangely consistent. To them, the world wasn't divided cleanly into science and nonsense. It was all part of God's great book of creation. If a fish could wear a fur coat, then surely it had a symbolic purpose. Some manuscripts even suggested the fur was a sign of sin, that the fish was clothed because it carried shame. Others saw it as divine generosity. God wouldn't leave his creatures naked in icy waters. Either way, meaning mattered more than biology. As you drift deeper into the tale, you realize this isn't just about one bizarre animal. It's about how medieval people saw nature as a puzzle box of symbols. A furry fish wasn't just funny, it was a moral lesson wrapped in scales and hair. Historians today still puzzle over how seriously these bestiaries were taken. Were they teaching tools, entertainment, quiet jokes monks passed between themselves? The answer may be all of the above. The blurry line between belief and satire is what makes these drawings so mesmerizing centuries later. Every few minutes, you hear the soft reminder, if you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because if a fish with fur already seems strange, the next creature will make even less sense. The section closes like the river freezing over again, sealing the memory of those hairy trout in ice. You're left with the image of a monk scratching his quill across parchment, carefully curling each strand of fur, as though God himself might check his accuracy. The furry fish becomes both hilarious and haunting, a mirror of how the medieval mind stitched myth into daily life. You chuckle once more at the thought of medieval mittens made from cod, and then settle in, because the next myth will drag you straight into a duel that makes even less sense. A snail facing off against a knight. But the next myth is even stranger. A shining armored knight, visor lowered, lance pointed, horse stamping with nervous energy, ready to charge. And across from him, the great enemy he must defeat in this epic duel, a garden snail. Yes, in medieval manuscripts, the margins are filled with knights squaring off against snails, as if the fate of Christendom depended on the outcome of this slippery showdown. For centuries, readers have scratched their heads at this odd pairing, wondering why medieval monks and scribes seemed obsessed with pitting humanity's fiercest warriors against creatures you can crush beneath your sandal. The myth here is simple. People once assumed these images were just jokes, doodles, scrawled by bored monks. The truth is, these bizarre duels carried weighty meanings about fear, power, and even faith. But of course, you'll want to laugh first, because nothing looks sillier than a proud knight trembling before a snail with its tiny horns peeking out of a shell. Now, let's flip it. Historians have proposed multiple theories, and each one makes the snail duel less like nonsense and more like an allegory. One theory is that the snail symbolized the Lombards, a group of bankers and moneylenders whom medieval society despised. Knights fighting snails, then, wasn't a joke at all, it was a symbolic smackdown of greed and corruption. Another theory suggests that snails stood in for mortality itself. They were slow, inevitable, creeping reminders of death. To show a knight battling a snail was to remind the reader that even the strongest armor and sharpest sword cannot fight off the creeping pace of time. And then there's the theory that the snail represented the underdog, the weak and humble, rising against the powerful. A monk doodling a snail facing a knight may have been poking fun at arrogance, suggesting that no matter how mighty you think you are, there's always some small, overlooked force that can knock you down. These snail duels appear consistently in manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, especially in France and England, which means they weren't random one-off jokes. They were part of a widespread visual culture. Some snails were even drawn with faces, teeth, or armored shells, almost as if they were being personified into little monsters. One manuscript shows a snail blowing a trumpet, as if declaring war on the knight. Historians still argue whether the snail's meaning was political satire, religious metaphor, or pure monkish humor. The fact that no one can agree after 700 years shows just how deliberately playful and mysterious these images were meant to be. Here's a mini-pov to bring it alive. Imagine a young scribe hunched over his parchment, carefully painting a shining knight, and then smirking as he draws a tiny snail lifting its antennae-like lances. He whispers to himself, "There, let's see if the abbot notices." In that small act, the margin doodle becomes both art and rebellion. A wink. Let's sprinkle in the jokes, because, how can you not? Joke 1. Knights probably dreaded the battle cry charge of the escargot. Joke 2. If the snail did win, the after-party would be the slowest parade in history. Joke 3. The real reason knights fought snails. Medieval gardeners were furious, and someone had to defend the cabbages. But beneath the laughter lies the strange pull of the allegory. Medieval people lived in a world of constant war, plague, and uncertainty. The snail duel was both absurd and profound, an image that mocked human pride, while reminding viewers of life's creeping threats. Even today, scholars revisit these drawings as a window into how humor and fear blended in medieval thought. The knights weren't just fighting snails, they were fighting the slow, grinding inevitabilities of life itself. As you imagine those duels frozen in illuminated manuscripts, the callback from Section 1 sneaks in. Just like the furry fish wearing coats to survive the cold, the snail carries its own armor. The natural world wasn't random, it was filled with symbols about weakness, strength, and survival. The knight versus snail battle is absurd, yes, but it's also a story about underestimation. Never laugh too hard at the little guy, because, in the medieval imagination, even a snail might have the last word. The story drifts onward, smooth and deliberate, as though you're watching knights line up on a battlefield that turns out to be nothing more than a garden bed. And yet, this whimsical image carried enough weight to be repeated across generations of manuscripts, suggesting it meant something vital to the people who copied it again and again. If you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because if you thought knights fighting snails was strange, wait until you meet dog-headed men who walked the earth in medieval imagination. But the next myth is even stranger. You trudge forward into the next illuminated page, and suddenly the air feels heavier, stranger. Gone are the snails jousting with knights. Now you find men with human bodies, full armor, weapons, even monks' robes sometimes, but their heads are those of dogs, snarling, drooling, eyes gleaming with a predatory light. These were the cynocephali, the dog-headed men of medieval imagination, and they weren't drawn as a joke. They were described, feared, and debated as if they might truly exist somewhere on the far edges of the world. The myth here was deadly serious. Many people in medieval Europe believed that distant lands were crawling with hybrid racist dog-headed men, one-footed men, men with faces in their chests. The dog-headed men stood out most of all, terrifying and fascinating at the same time. Now, the flip. These cynocephali weren't just random doodles. They were a direct inheritance from ancient Greek and Roman writings. Authors like Pliny the Elder had described strange races supposedly found in India or Ethiopia, and medieval scribes copied and expanded on those tales. The dog-headed man became a symbol of everything alien, everything outside the safe world of Christian Europe. He was the embodiment of the other, dangerous, exotic, sometimes even redeemable. Some medieval stories, said the cynocephali, barked instead of speaking, making them seem less than human. But other texts insisted they could be converted to Christianity, that even a snarling, dog-headed knight might kneel at the altar and find grace. So what started as a monstrous myth became a moral test case. Could salvation reach even those who seemed inhuman? Travelers' accounts, like those of John Mandeville, spread the idea that dog-headed men roamed the earth. His widely read travelogue described entire tribes of cynocephali living far to the east. One famous medieval story tells of Saint Christopher, himself being portrayed as a dog-headed man in some traditions, especially in the Byzantine East, before later being reimagined with a normal human face. Historians still argue whether medieval audiences took these creatures literally, as in, they thought they truly existed somewhere far away, or whether they understood them as allegories of sin, barbarism, or outsider status. Let's bring it alive with a mini. Imagine a weary crusader trudging across dusty roads, hearing campfire tales of a tribe of warriors with jaws like hounds and teeth sharp enough to chew through shields. He clutches his sword tighter, wondering if tomorrow's battle might be against men who look like beasts. That image, whispered from soldier to soldier, gave the cynocephali a terrifying reality. And now for the jokes, because even nightmares can turn absurd. Joke 1. If dog-headed men were real, every medieval battlefield would have sounded like a kennel during feeding time. Joke 2. Imagine trying to negotiate peace talks. Sit, stay, now roll over and accept the treaty. Joke 3. The real problem wasn't war, it was that they probably demanded walkies twice a day. But underneath the humor, the deeper meaning surfaces. Dog-headed men represented the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between what was human and what was animal. To draw or describe them was to wrestle with a question that still haunts us: what truly separates us from the beasts? The callback from Section 2 slips in here. Just as knights squared off against snails, thinking themselves above the small and slow, so too did Europe paint the East as monstrous and alien. The enemy is always other, whether it's a garden snail or an imagined dog-headed man. you drift deeper into this narrative, realizing that medieval maps often placed these creatures at the very edges of the known world. It wasn't just about zoology, it was about psychology. To the medieval mind, the edges of the map had to contain the monstrous, because what else could possibly live where no Christian had yet ventured? The cynocephali were less about dogs and more about fear itself. They were a mirror of the anxieties gnawing at a continent that always felt surrounded by unknown threats. Soft reminder, if you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because trust me, if dog-headed men make your imagination twitch, the unicorn you're about to meet is nothing like the pure white fairy tale creature you think it is. In fact, in the medieval imagination, unicorns carried a deadly secret, one that might just make you look at every children's storybook in a very different way. But the next myth is even stranger. You turn the page, expecting relief after snarling dogheads, and there it is, the unicorn. At first glance, it looks familiar, almost comforting. A slender horse with a single long horn rising from its forehead, shimmering with mystical power. But wait, don't let your modern fairy tale instincts fool you. In the medieval imagination, unicorns weren't cute rainbow companions for children's cartoons. They were dangerous, violent, and sometimes lethal. The myth of the unicorn that survives today, the gentle, pure creature that only a maiden can tame, comes directly out of this medieval world. But what most people forget is that the unicorn was also seen as untamable, wild to the point of bloodshed, and symbolic of both holiness and death. Now the flip. Medieval bestiaries consistently describe the unicorn as a savage beast, small but ferocious, able to gore elephants with its horn. Yes, elephants, those lumbering beasts that monks could barely imagine slain in stories by a creature the size of a goat. The horn wasn't just a spear. It was believed to be a source of magical purity, able to cleanse poisoned water or detect toxins in a king's goblet. That's why medieval kings and bishops collected what they thought were unicorn horns, though in reality, they were usually narwhal tusks traded at enormous prices. The myth fed the economy of relics, with unicorn horns passed around like treasures of divine protection. But the truth is that the unicorn's image was never innocent. It was both savior and killer, healer and destroyer, a paradox inked into every illuminated manuscript. The idea of unicorns spread across Europe in bestiaries that tied them explicitly to Christ, often showing a unicorn resting its head in the lap of a virgin, symbolizing the incarnation. The Danish kings in the Renaissance claimed to own unicorn horns, and one of them was even carved into a throne, an enormous seat made from tusks that everyone believed were proof of the unicorn's reality. Historians still argue how literally medieval people took the unicorn stories. Some evidence suggests elites knew they were buying narwhal tusks but let the legend spread anyway, because a magical unicorn horn had far more cultural and religious power than we bought this from a fisherman in the Arctic. Imagine a monk carefully illuminating a unicorn on vellum, dipping his quill, writing that only a pure maiden could lure the beast to rest. His hand shakes slightly as he adds the blood-red details of the horn piercing an elephant's side. In that moment, the unicorn is not a bedtime story, it's a symbol of violence wrapped in holiness. And now, let's give you the jokes to keep the rhythm flowing. Joke 1. Medieval people would have been shocked to see our toy stores. You mean to tell me this deadly beast is now sold in glittery pink backpacks? Joke 2. If unicorn horns really cured poison, half the royal courts of Europe would have survived their dinner parties. Joke 3. The only unicorn most peasants saw was the neighbor's goat with one horn broken off. But beneath the laughter, the allegory is sharp. The unicorn symbolized Christ wild and untamable, yet captured by purity. At the same time, it symbolized danger, temptation, and death. Just like the dog-headed men, it blurred the line between the real and the imagined. And just like the snails battling knights, it carried a moral about pride and humility. The callback from section 1 lands here to think of the furry fish mistaken for nature's joke, and then compare it to the unicorn mistaken for divine proof. Both are examples of people seeing what they wanted to see, crafting meaning out of mystery. The more you drift with this tale, the clearer it becomes. Medieval minds weren't foolish, they were imaginative in ways we've almost forgotten. They lived in a world without hard borders between real and unreal, where a horn could both kill and save, where the story mattered more than the zoology. If you're still awake, here's your reminder. Subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't vanish. Because the next myth is even stranger. You've seen furry fish, dueling snails, dog-headed men, and unicorns dripping with paradox. But what could possibly top them? Well, how about the most unlikely assassin in all of medieval art, the killer rabbit? But the next myth is even stranger. You drift further into the manuscript, lulled by the golden glow of the painted borders, when suddenly you stop. There, in the corner, hopping lightly across the page, is a rabbit. Not the fluffy, innocent rabbit you imagine from children's stories or spring gardens, but a rabbit armed to the teeth, brandishing a sword, spearing knights, and even dragging men away in ropes. Welcome to one of the most unsettling and hilarious images of medieval imagination, the killer rabbit. The myth in your modern head says bunnies are harmless, soft, and cute. In the medieval mind, rabbits could turn into ruthless predators, flipping the natural order upside down. The joke wasn't random, it carried a warning, a parody, and maybe even a dark reflection of fear hiding in the margins. Now the flip. The killer rabbit wasn't just a scribal prank. Rabbits symbolized cowardice in medieval culture, creatures always running away, always hiding. To show rabbits suddenly turning on humans and knights was a deliberate reversal, a satirical punch. It mocked knights who prided themselves on bravery, suggesting that even the weakest and most timid could, in the right moment, become terrifying. Some manuscripts depicted entire armies of rabbits, capturing people in nets, slaughtering dogs, or leading prisoners bound in chains. The sight is both absurd and chilling, a reminder that roles of power can always reverse. Rabbits appear frequently in medieval bestiaries, often tied to cowardice and fertility. In the Smithfield Decretals, a famous illuminated manuscript, one entire marginal scene shows a rabbit literally decapitating a man with casual brutality. Historians still argue whether killer rabbits were pure satire meant to amuse, or whether they carried deeper social criticism about the instability of power and the absurdity of violence. Imagine a tired knight resting after battle, cracking open a book only to see a rabbit skewering a man who looks suspiciously like him. He frowns, mutters, If even the rabbits are against us, what hope do we have? That moment of uneasy laughter captures the entire point. Nothing was sacred in the margins. Now for the jokes, because this section almost writes them for us. Joke 1. Monty Python's Holy Grail killer rabbit wasn't new, it was practically a medieval documentary. Joke 2. If these rabbits existed, no garden would ever need a scarecrow. The rabbits would be the scare. Joke 3. Imagine peasants gathering around fires, whispering, "Beware the bunny. It's already behind you." Yet behind the absurdity lies something more. The killer rabbit was satire, sharpened like a blade. It questioned the hierarchy of knightly valor, mocked the fragility of strength, and hinted at chaos lurking behind order. In a world where wars, plagues, and famines appended lives daily, perhaps rabbits turning violent wasn't so unthinkably, was a metaphor for the sudden, random violence of reality. Here's where a callback pulls you back to earlier sections. Remember the snails dueling knights, mocking pride? The killer rabbit was a cousin of that same joke, magnified to absurdity. The snail mocked power slowly. The rabbit mocked it with speed and savagery. And if you think about the furry fish and unicorn horns, you see the same rhythm, nature reshaped into allegory, animals reimagined as mirrors of human folly. As your mind lingers on these murderous bunnies, you can't help but laugh and shiver at once. The medieval page was never just decoration, it was commentary, rebellion, humor, and horror stitched together. Killer rabbits proved that even the most innocent symbol could flip into terror, leaving the viewer unsettled. If you're still awake, subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't slip past you. Because, as strange as sword-wielding rabbits may seem, the next myth is even stranger. You'll meet lions so badly drawn they don't even look like lions at all, proof that imagination sometimes replaced observation entirely. But the next myth is even stranger. The page turns again, and here comes the king of beasts. You expect majesty, a golden mane, a roaring mouth, a predator that rules the animal world. But the medieval lion you meet looks, well, a lot like a confused farm dog that wandered into the manuscript. Sometimes it has a face like a pug, sometimes a body like a cow, and often the mane looks more like a shaggy wig thrown together in haste. The myth here is clear. Medieval artists believed they were drawing the mighty, regal lion. The truth, though, is that most of them had never seen one. What you get instead is a lion by rumor, a lion filtered through second-hand description, a lion more imagined than observed. Now the flip. Lions in medieval culture weren't about zoology, they were about symbolism. Every bestiary praised the lion as the noblest of animals, tying it to Christ himself. Stories claimed lions slept with their eyes open, symbolizing divine vigilance. Others said lion cubs were born dead and revived by their father's breath. Accuracy didn't matter. The lion was an emblem of courage, strength, and holiness. So when artists painted lions that looked suspiciously like oversized dogs, they weren't failing. They were translating the idea of lion into visual shorthand that carried moral weight. To them, what mattered was not what a lion looked like, but what it meant. European artists who lived far from royal menageries had no access to living lions. They relied on hearsay, travelers' tales, and earlier drawings copied endlessly. Some manuscript lions have split tongues, horse-like tails, or even hooves, hybrid mashups of animals that supposedly captured their essence. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether artists actually cared about accuracy at all, or whether their audience wouldn't have recognized a lion even if one sat in their village square. Picture a monk in a northern abbey, quill hovering, muttering, "Lion, lion, yes, that's the king of beasts," as he glances at the abbey's sheepdog and thinks, "Close enough." He paints a mane, adds a tail, and congratulates himself on capturing nobility. And of course, jokes slip in. Joke 1. Medieval lions look less like Simba and more like the family pet after a bad haircut. Joke 2. If knights really met these lions, they'd throw sticks instead of drawing swords. Joke 3. The only thing scarier about these lions was the thought of showing them to an actual African hunter. Yet behind the humor lies something deeper. These badly drawn lions show us how medieval knowledge wasn't about first-hand observation, but about tradition. A lion drawn wrong still carried the right meaning, because meaning came from text and scripture, not from zoology. The callback sharpens this point. Think of the unicorn horns traded as relics. Nobody cared if they were narwhal tusks. They mattered because of the story attached. Likewise, a lion that looked like a dog still roared in the imagination, because the symbol was stronger than the shape. The more you linger, the more you sense the strangeness of this logic. In a world where so few people traveled, imagination filled the gaps of experience. A lion could look like a dog, just as a rabbit could murder knights, just as snails could duel armored men. Accuracy was irrelevant. Meaning was everything. If you're still awake, let this thought settle. How much of what we believe today is based not on first-hand experience, but on stories, traditions, and symbols? Subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because if dog-faced men and dog-shaped lions weren't odd enough, the next myth is even stranger. You'll see why monks painted seductive mermaids in their holy books, not as fairy tales, but as puzzles of sin and salvation. But the next myth is even stranger. The candlelight flickers across the next manuscript page, and suddenly you're staring into a pair of eyes, half human, half something else. Flowing hair cascades down, a soft smile curves at the lips, but from the waist down there's only scales and fins. Yes, it's a mermaid painted not in sailors' journals, but in the margins of holy books. The myth in our modern minds says mermaids are whimsical creatures of fairy tales, dreamlike and harmless. But the truth in the medieval imagination is far sharper. To them, mermaids were not bedtime fantasy, but warnings, embodiments of temptation, symbols of sin swimming just beneath the surface of faith. Now the flip. These mermaids appeared in psalters, bestiaries, and even Bibles, often perched in the margins like silent seductions, watching readers at prayer. They were linked to the deadly power of lust, the fear of women's allure, and the chaos of the sea. In a world where sailors vanished on voyages and storms claimed ships overnight, the mermaid became both the cause and the symbol of that peril. She was beautiful enough to lure you, but her embrace meant drowning. Medieval bestiaries warned that mermaids sang songs to charm men into forgetting God, their voices rising from the deep like sirens of doom. And yet, just like unicorns, they weren't only threats, they were theological puzzles. Some argued mermaids symbolized the church itself, beautiful above, imperfect below. Others said they were half warnings, half promises, images of the split between body and soul. Mermaids appear in 12th and 13th century bestiaries, often described alongside sirens, with emphasis on their seductive songs. In some illustrations, mermaids are shown holding mirrors and combs, medieval shorthand for vanity and sin. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether scribes inserted mermaids into sacred texts as serious allegory or sly critique reminders that even holy men weren't free of temptation, even in the scriptorium. Picture a monk bent over his manuscript, dipping his quill as the night stretches late. His thoughts wander, and instead of a lion or snail, his pen curves into a woman with scales, her hair flowing across the vellum. He mutters a prayer under his breath, then keeps drawing, both fearful and fascinated. The jokes swim in naturally. Joke 1. Medieval mermaids were less Disney princesses, and more don't trust anyone with a comb by the sea. Joke 2. If sailors actually met one, they'd probably ask, so, is the top half or the bottom half dangerous? Joke 3. Forget Shipsini. Medieval fishermen who hooked one would have rewritten the bestiary as a love letter. Yet the deeper thread pulls you in. Mermaids revealed how medieval minds blended reality with fear, myth with moral lesson. Just like the furry fish mistaken for fur coats, just like the dog-headed men placed at the world's edges, the mermaid wasn't about zoology. She was about warning the reader about lust, vanity, danger, and temptation. A callback anchors you further. Remember how the unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin? The mermaid was the flip side, a woman whose purity was false, whose beauty hid death. Both creatures reflected medieval anxieties about women, power, and temptation. As the section glides toward its close, the image of the mermaid lingers. She's both alluring and terrifying, promising escape from dull monastic life and threatening eternal damnation in the same breath. To laugh at her is easy. To realize she mirrored fears men carried into every prayer is sobering. If you're still awake, subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't slip away. Because, as unsettling as mermaids in holy books may be, the next myth is even stranger. You'll meet a humble animal, the beaver that medieval storytellers imagined committing an act so bizarre, so shocking, that you'll never look at the creature the same way again. But the next myth is even stranger. You turn another page, and suddenly you're staring at a creature you think you know well, the beaver. Broad tail, sharp teeth, a builder of dams and lodges. But in medieval manuscripts, this furry engineer wasn't remembered for gnawing trees. No, it was famous for a gruesome act of self-mutilation. The myth says that when hunters chased a beaver for its prized castoreum, the glands used in medieval medicine, it would stop, bite off its own testicles, and toss them to the pursuers as a peace offering. The hunters, satisfied, would let it go, and the beaver, though forever changed, would scamper back to its watery home. Now the flip. The idea wasn't just a bloody joke, it was moral allegory. Medieval bestiaries framed the beaver's act as a lesson in renunciation. Just as the beaver gave up part of itself to save its life, so too should Christians abandon sin to save their souls. If temptation chased you, the text implied, better to cut it away than be destroyed. The story wasn't zoology, was theology dressed in fur and teeth. And yet some people did believe it, passing the myth along as natural fact. Monks repeated it solemnly, not as satire, but as sacred lesson, turning an animal's imaginary sacrifice into an emblem of virtue. Bestiaries from the 12th and 13th centuries consistently describe this castration myth as if it were real natural history. Some manuscripts depict beavers literally holding their testicles in their teeth while hunters turn away in satisfaction, grim little cartoons that still shock modern viewers. Scholarly debate. Historians argue whether anyone actually believed beavers performed this act, or whether audiences understood it purely as allegory. Some suggest that the persistence of the tale shows people genuinely thought it might be true. Imagine a weary peasant crouched by a stream, hoping to trap a beaver for its fur, only to see the animal chomp, squeal, and toss something horrifying onto the grass. The man drops his net, mutters a prayer, and flees. Whether true or not, that imagined scene carried moral force enough to last centuries. And here come the jokes, because even horror needs laughter. Joke 1. The beaver was the original minimalist. You can't take what I've already thrown away. Joke 2. Medieval hunters must have felt cheated. We risked our necks for that. Joke 3. If beavers really did this, no animal on earth deserved a therapist more. But under the absurdity, the allegory cuts deep. The beaver story wasn't really about rodents. It was about people struggling with sin and survival. It warned readers to sacrifice temptation before temptation destroyed them. Callbacks ripple here, just as the unicorn symbolized purity captured, just as mermaids symbolized lust's danger. So too did the beaver embody the harsh lesson that salvation required surrender. The medieval imagination never left animals as mere animals. They were sermons in fur, feathers, and scales. As the candle burns low, you realize how strange the logic feels to us, but how natural it must have seemed then. If the world was God's book, every creature carried a hidden line of text, a moral stitched into its body, even if that text was bloody, absurd, or cruel. If you're still awake, subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't vanish. Because if you thought beavers throwing parts of themselves at hunters was strange, the next myth is even stranger. You'll see why dragons, the most terrifying of beasts, were drawn in bestiaries, as if they were everyday animals wandering the edge of the village. But the next myth is even stranger. The parchment shifts again, and suddenly your eyes lock onto a familiar silhouette, wings outstretched, scales rippling, fire curling from its jaws. The dragon, the great terror of legend. In your mind, dragons live in fantasy novels and films, soaring over castles, breathing flames, symbols of pure imagination. But in the medieval imagination, dragons weren't fantasy, they were natural history. Bestiaries described them as real animals, no different from lions or bears, as if you could walk far enough through dark forests or deserts and stumble upon one curled in a cave. The myth in modern thought says dragons are fairy tale monsters. The truth in medieval books is that dragons were treated as everyday beasts, terrifying, yes, but catalogued alongside owls, elephants, and fish. Now the flip. Dragons were moral creatures as much as zoological ones. They were symbols of Satan, of sin, of death itself. Bestiaries claimed dragons lived in caves, strangled elephants with their tails, and breathed poison into the air. They weren't written as make-believe. They were written as cautionary fact. To say dragons existed was to reinforce the spiritual landscape of the world. Every threat outside mirrored the eternal threat of evil. The dragon's fire was hell's fire, its wings the wings of demons, its lair the pit of damnation. Yet, in an odd twist, some texts calmly noted how to kill a dragon, as if giving practical advice: pierce its softer underbelly. Avoid the tail's constriction, and don't inhale its toxic breath. It reads less like mythology and more like a medieval survival manual. Isidore of Seville, one of the most influential writers of the early Middle Ages, listed dragons among real animals in his encyclopedic works. Some manuscripts painted dragons smaller than dogs, curled like lizards in the margins, suggesting not all scribes thought of them as titans. Sometimes they were pests more than terrors. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether most medieval readers literally believed in dragons, or whether they accepted them as allegorical shorthand. The sheer consistency of dragon entries, however, suggests at least some took them seriously. Imagine a traveler telling a tale by firelight. His voice lowers, eyes wide, as he insists he saw it: a dragon perched on a cliff, wings folded, tail dragging across stone. The peasants listening clutch their cloaks tighter, staring into the dark hills beyond, wondering if tonight they, too, might hear wings. Time for the jokes, because even monsters invite laughter. Joke 1. Medieval people might have been the first to invent "do not disturb" signs. Just nail one outside a cave that said "dragon sleeping." Joke 2. If dragons were so common, no night's resume would be complete without "yes, I slayed 3 before breakfast." Joke 3. Peasants probably just shrugged and said, "Well, at least a dragon keeps the rent collectors away." And yet, behind the humor lies the power of belief. To treat dragons as real was to live in a world where the boundary between myth and nature blurred. Callbacks sharpen the idea, just like the beaver's bizarre self-surgery, just like the unicorn's paradoxical purity. The dragon embodied morality as much as zoology. You weren't just reading about monsters, you were reading about sin itself, painted in scales. As you drift deeper, you realize how much comfort it gave medieval minds to name their fears. To draw a dragon was to capture evil, to give it form, to make it manageable even, if only in paint and parchment. In their eyes, to believe in dragons wasn't naive. It was logical. The world was dangerous, full of invisible demons. Why wouldn't some of them look like scaled beasts with fire in their lungs? If you're still awake, subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't slip past you. Because, as terrifying as dragons might seem, the next myth is even stranger. You'll see why medieval people painted owls, not as wise guardians of the night, but as sinister creatures carrying the stench of evil. But the next myth is even stranger. The candle sputters, shadows stretch long, and in the next manuscript margin you see an owl. Today you think wisdom, Hogwarts libraries, the bird of Athena, the quiet companion of scholars. But in the medieval imagination, the owl wasn't wise, it was wicked. The myth of the owl as a creature of knowledge is modern. The truth is that medieval artists painted owls as sinister omens, symbols of sin and filth, evil wrapped in feathers. To them, the owl wasn't a philosopher's friend. It was the embodiment of corruption, hiding from the light of God. Now the flip. Bestiaries described owls as birds that shunned daylight, hiding in ruins, graveyards, and abandoned places. Their love of darkness made them symbols of sinners who turned away from truth, preferring shadows to light. Some monks even linked owls to demons, watching silently from the rafters of ruined churches, their calls echoing like unholy laughter. Where today we see wisdom, medieval people saw danger. The owl's round eyes weren't windows to knowledge. They were staring reminders of souls too blind to see salvation. Yet, paradoxically, some texts admitted owls had value. They warned of death, reminded people to repent, and gave physical shape to the idea of spiritual blindness. The asterisk, physiologus asterisk, an early Christian bestiary, cemented the owl's reputation as a symbol of sin, spreading the image across Europe. Some manuscripts show owls being attacked by flocks of smaller birds, an allegory for sinners despised by the faithful. Historians still argue whether owls were universally feared or whether local traditions sometimes saw them as useful vermin. The balance suggests fear outweighed respect. Imagine a monk pacing the monastery at night, hearing the low hoot from the woods beyond. He crosses himself, mutters a prayer, and hurries inside, convinced the sound was no bird at all, but a demon announcing its presence. And now the jokes, because even evil owls deserve a laugh. Joke 1. If owls were evil, medieval people clearly never met one, otherwise Hogwarts would have been a horror story. Joke 2. The owl of sin sounds less like a beast and more like a tavern name monks avoided after curfew. Joke 3. Peasants probably thought owls were just tax collectors in disguise appearing at night, unwelcome and always watching. But deeper meaning weighs the laughter down. Owls were reminders of the pull of darkness, of the way people strayed from the light. Their very habits' silent wings, nocturnal hunts mirrored spiritual blindness. The callback threads connect. Remember the mermaids, who lured men away with beauty. The beavers, who symbolized renunciation. The dragons embodying sin itself. The owl joins them, a feathered sermon perched in the margins. As you linger on this strange reversal, you feel the sharp difference between then and now. To us, the owl is wisdom. To them, it was corruption. That shift in meaning reveals just how fluid symbols can be, how culture reshapes nature until a bird becomes a moral parable. If you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because if owls as evil spirits seemed unsettling, the next myth is even stranger. You'll meet the medieval elephanta creature, so badly misunderstood, so clumsily drawn that it barely resembles reality at all. But the next myth is even stranger. You turn another leaf, expecting majesty, and there it is, the elephant, the largest beast known to man. Or at least, that's what the monk thought he was drawing. What you actually see looks less like an elephant and more like a fat horse with flappy ears, or sometimes even a pig with a hose stuck on its face. The myth here is obvious. People believed elephants were the most noble and wondrous animals of the earth. The truth is that medieval artists had almost no idea what an elephant actually looked like, so their attempts turned into strange, sometimes comical caricatures. Yet, for all their errors, these drawings still carried enormous weight as moral lessons. In their stories, elephants were mighty, but also symbols of humility. They were said to live for hundreds of years, never kneel, and be so chaste they refused lust. Bestiaries insisted elephants lacked joints in their legs, which meant if one fell, it could not stand without the help of another, turning the animal into a living sermon on community and support. The strangest detail. To mate, elephants supposedly traveled all the way to the east, beneath a specific tree, in silence, so that no one could see their modesty. These weren't zoological notes. They were theological allegories. An elephant wasn't just an animal, it was a living mirror of Christian values. Travelers' accounts made the confusion worse. Crusaders and merchants returned with wild stories, and monks painted them faithfully. That's why one manuscript shows elephants with castle towers on their backs, lumbering like moving fortresses, even though the artist clearly never saw one outside a rumor. Some scribes turned trunks into snouts, tusks into horns, and legs into pillars, so thick the beast looked immovable. Reality mattered less than meaning. The elephant was important because it embodied both strength and moral order. Imagine a scribe, hunched over vellum, staring at a sketch from another book, muttering, "So this is the elephant. Looks like a cow, but bigger." He dips his quill, draws wide ears like sails, then adds a ridiculous tail. To him, accuracy is irrelevant. The point is to tell a story about virtue. The humor writes itself. If these were the elephants knights went to fight, they would have brought hay bales instead of lances. Another laugh. Some of these medieval elephants look so much like dogs in armor, you'd half expect them to fetch sticks. And finally, you picture peasants peering into the manuscript, nodding solemnly at a beast that looks nothing like reality, muttering, "Ah yes, truly a marvel of God." Yet, underneath the laughter, the moral meaning remains strong. The elephant taught readers about loyalty, chastity, and community. It reminded them of virtues they needed in their own lives. And it carried the same weight as every strange creature we've met, the furry fish showing nature's mysteries, the snail mocking night's pride, the mermaid warning against temptation, the dragon breathing sin itself. The elephant disaster shows us that accuracy didn't matter. Faith and symbolism mattered more than truth. As the image lingers, the thought presses in. How often do we today do the same? We fill in gaps in our knowledge with stories, pictures, and assumptions. Medieval elephants, as laughable as they seem, are mirrors of how people everywhere cling to meaning when truth is just out of reach. If you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because, as bizarre as these misshapen elephants appear, the next myth is even stranger. You'll find snakes with human faces slithering through the pages. Creatures meant to embody sins crawling straight into the reader's imagination. But the next myth is even stranger. The candle burns low, the manuscript's edge curls, and your eyes land on a creature slithering across the page. At first, it's a snake, coiling as expected, tongue flicking, scales gleaming in paint. But then you look closer, and the head isn't serpentine at all, it's human. Round eyes, parted lips, sometimes even a monk's tonsure painted above its brow. This is the medieval serpent with a human face, one of the most unsettling hybrids in the bestiaries. The myth was that snakes were simply venomous reptiles, crawling symbols of temptation. The truth in these pages was more disturbing. Snakes could borrow humanity itself, twisting it into a symbol of sin wearing a mask. Medieval stories gave snakes a vast symbolic role. They represented Satan in Eden, lust coiling in shadows, deception lying in wait. To give them human faces was to make them even more personal, more accusing. These weren't just random reptiles, they were allegories of human weakness. The bestiary warned that serpents crept into homes and churches alike, whispering temptation in a voice too familiar. Sometimes they were drawn with faces of kings or monks. Sly nods at corruption inside the very institutions that taught from these books. In this way, the snake became not just a monster in the field, but a mirror of the sinful heart. Writers layered the stories thick. Some said serpents sucked milk from cattle, or lulled victims with soft voices before striking. Others claimed they slithered into people's mouths as they slept, coiling in the stomach, feeding on flesh from within. To the medieval imagination, snakes weren't background animals. They were central villains in the eternal battle between light and dark. Adding a human face only drove the point home. The worst evil looked just like you. Picture a peasant dozing by a hearth, jerking awake after a nightmare of a snake speaking in his brother's voice. He shakes the vision away, but when he next enters church, he notices the same slithering face drawn in the margins of the psalter. Suddenly, the snake isn't only in the dream, it's watching him from holy pages to. The jokes offer brief relief. If snakes with human faces were real, medieval pest control would have required not traps but therapists. Another laugh. Imagine confessing, "Forgive me, Father, the snake with my neighbor's face tempted me again." And finally, one quip more. Medieval farmers probably wondered if these things hissed or just argued with you over taxes. But the deeper message weighs heavier than laughter. Snakes embodied corruption and deceit, and painting them with human faces turned allegory into accusation. This wasn't distant mythology, it was moral policing in paint, reminding readers that sin isn't always monstrous on the surface. Sometimes it looks familiar, even friendly. Callbacks coil back here, just as the mermaid warned of beauty hiding death, just as the owl represented sinners clinging to shadows. The human-faced serpent embodied deception crawling straight out of Eden. It's another piece of the same medieval puzzle, animals transformed into sermons. The page closes slowly, scales glinting in fading light, and you realize the horror isn't the snake itself, but the recognition of something human lurking in its eyes. If you're still awake, subscribe now so tomorrow's secret doesn't slip away. Because if snakes with human faces felt unsettling, the next myth is even stranger. You'll meet a goat painted not as livestock, but as a gluttonous monster, an animal so greedy it became a medieval meme of excess. But the next myth is even stranger. The pages turn again, and this time the creature seems familiar, even harmless. A goat, shaggy and four-legged, a companion of barns and mountain pastures. But in the medieval imagination, goats weren't just mischievous grazers. They were insatiable devourers, beasts of unending appetite. The myth in modern eyes is that goats are silly farm animals, climbing on rooftops and chewing on laundry. The truth in medieval manuscripts is stranger. Goats were symbols of gluttony, creatures so greedy they'd eat anything, even things no animal should. In some bestiaries, they were said to devour fire, stones, or even human corpses if left unguarded. The goat wasn't merely livestock, it was appetite without limit. The story spiraled into moral warnings. A goat munching endlessly became a sermon about sin, about how unchecked desire consumes not just the body, but the soul. The goat's constant grazing on the highest cliffs turned into a protophore for pride creatures climbing where they didn't belong, then falling to their deaths. Their horns symbolized aggression, their eyes lust, their hunger vanity. The goat was a medieval meme, the animal you pointed to when describing the neighbor who ate too much, drank too much, or lusted too much. Travelers and monks exaggerated its habits further. They wrote that goats could chew iron chains apart, that they'd strip a tree of bark in a single hour, that they'd swallow clothes hung out to dry. Some drawings even show goats lunging for human flesh, not just plants. Whether anyone believed this literally or not, the image stuck. The goat became gluttony in fur, a walking parable scribbled into the margins of prayer. Imagine a village boy carrying a loaf of bread across a courtyard, chased suddenly by a goat who leaps, knocks him down, and devours the loaf whole. The boy cries, the villagers laugh, and somewhere a monk scribbles a note. So it is with sin, it consumes what is good before you can guard it. The jokes practically write themselves. If medieval goats really ate everything, they were the first garbage disposal units. Another laugh. Peasants probably cursed, even the devil doesn't eat as much as my goat. And one more. In a manuscript, a goat's eyes always look hungry, as if staring straight at your dinner plate through the centuries. But beneath the humor lies the meaning. The goat wasn't funny to its readers. It was frightening. It reminded them of hunger unchecked, of vices unchained. The callback threads in, just as the beaver gave up parts of itself to survive, just as the rabbit reversed roles to kill knights. The goat showed what happens when desire rules unchecked. Animals weren't just animals, they were sermons grazing at the edge of imagination. The page seems to crackle as you stare at the painted goat, its jaw wide, its tongue curling. You realize this isn't simply a drawing of livestock, it's a warning that nothing devours faster than appetite, and nothing destroys faster than greed. If you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because if goats chewing through firewood seemed unsettling, the next myth is even stranger. Birds sprout legs they never should have had. Winged creatures walking like beasts across the margins, leaving scholars baffled for centuries. But the next myth is even stranger. The manuscript opens again, and this time the page is filled with birds. Wings spread, feathers bright, beaks sharp. But then you notice something wrong. These aren't ordinary sparrows or doves. They have 4 legs, not 2, for birds striding across the margins like little griffins, claws clattering along with wings folded at their sides. The myth today says medieval artists were clumsy, too unskilled to draw birds correctly. The truth is stranger. 4-legged birds were painted deliberately, symbols of distortion, satire, and sometimes imagination gone unchecked. The stories around them were tangled. Some scribes claimed that certain birds grew legs when they landed, so they could walk like beasts. Others may have doubled their legs to exaggerate strength, a way of saying, this bird can outrun as well as outfly. More often, though, the 4-legged bird was a symbol of excess creatures, given more than they needed. representing greed or arrogance. Why 2 legs when you can have 4? Why be content when you can demand more? 2 medieval minds. Even this absurdity carried a moral sting. Illustrators may also have used the image as comic relief after pages of lions, dragons, and unicorns. Suddenly, a little bird struts across the corner with 4 stubby legs, like a parody of creation. It made readers laugh, yes, but also reflect. Wasn't it true that people too often tried to take more than their share? That unnatural abundance, like a bird with 4 legs, was grotesque, even dangerous. Picture a monk, weary at his desk, scratching out a sparrow, and then chuckling as he adds 2 extra legs. He leans back, smirks, and thinks, yes, that will make the abbot frown. In that moment, the 4-legged bird is both joke and commentary, a wink across the centuries. The humor lands easily for us. If 4-legged birds were real, medieval people would have invented double-sized perches. Another laugh. Peasants might have wondered, do we roast the legs or the wings first? And one more. If they really existed, the poor worms on the ground wouldn't stand a chance. 4 claws instead of 2. But behind the comedy is meaning. Birds symbolized freedom, soul, transcendence. To give them 4 legs was to weigh them down, to make them grotesque, to show what happens when purity is corrupted. The callback rises here. Remember, the owl turned from wisdom to evil. The goat turned from livestock to glutton. The beaver turned from builder to self-castrator. The bird with 4 legs joins the distortion, a lesson wrapped in absurdity. The image lingers as you close your eyes, feathers and claws overlapping in unnatural ways. It's unsettling, not because it looks real, but because it doesn't hand, yet still makes sense in its moral frame. Too much is as bad as too little, the scribes whispered, and they said it with a doodle of a bird that couldn't exist. If you're still awake, subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's secret. Because as strange as 4-legged birds appear, the next myth is even stranger. It's the final page of our journey. The last beast in the book. A cow that doesn't look like a cow at all, but like a dragon stitched into barnyard skin. But the next myth is even stranger. The final page of the manuscript unfolds, and there in the corner you see a cow. Or at least, that's what the scribe intended. But something has gone terribly wrong. The body is bulky and bovine, the hooves clumsy, but the tail coils like a serpent. The mouth gapes with sharp teeth, and strange wings sprout from its back. This is no ordinary farm animal. This is a cow drawn to look like a dragon, an impossible hybrid that leaves you wondering if the artist was confused, careless, or deliberately turning livestock into monsters. The myth says cows were simple beasts of milk and meat, harmless and ordinary. The truth in these books is that even the most familiar animals could be twisted into symbols of chaos and fear. The cow-dragon hybrid appeared in bestiaries as warnings against complacency. Just because something looks familiar doesn't mean it's safe. The idea was simple but powerful. Sin hides in plain sight. Just as a serpent once hid in Eden, so too could a cow sprout fangs in the margins. This grotesque beast reminded readers that corruption lurked everywhere, even in barns, even in milk pails. The medieval world was fragile, every comfort shadowed by menace, and the cow dragon captured that perfectly. Descriptions went further. Some texts claimed the beast breathed foul air that sickened cattle nearby. Others suggested it was born of witches' spells, a demon disguised as livestock to infiltrate herds. In illustrations, its eyes glared with fire, its tail lashed like a whip, and its udders still hung beneath it, grotesquely ordinary against the monstrous frame. The point was not zoology, was allegory. The familiar could be twisted into horror without warning. Imagine a shepherd stumbling into the field at dawn, lantern swinging, only to find his best milker huffing smoke and baring teeth. He drops the bucket and runs, shouting to the village. In that moment, the cow dragon isn't just a joke, it's the embodiment of fear, the uncanny born from the everyday. The humor still slips through. If dragons really did milk themselves, medieval dairy markets would have been chaos. Another laugh. Peasants probably said, "No wonder the cheese tastes strange." And one more. If knights fought dragon cows, the battlefield would have smelled more like barns than brimstone. Yet the meaning pushes past the laughter. This final creature shows the medieval obsession with blending the ordinary and the monstrous. Just as rabbits turned into killers, snails into enemies of knights, lions into dogs, and birds into grotesque hybrids, the cow dragon closed the circle. It proved no creature was too plain to escape transformation into a sermon. Every beast, from exotic elephants to barnyard cows, carried hidden lessons. Callbacks bind the journey together. The furry fish began this voyage, blurring reality with myth. The snail mocked power. The unicorn twisted purity into paradox. The beaver sacrificed itself for survival. The goat devoured everything. And now the cow dragon, standing at the edge of imagination, reminds you of the central truth. In the medieval world, nothing was drawn for decoration alone. Every creature was a warning, a story, a mirror. As the candle dies and the manuscript closes, you're left with that unsettling image: a beast, both ordinary and impossible. A cow that looked like a dragon, milk and fire, comfort and menace, stitched together. If you're still awake, here's the final reminder. Subscribe before you drift off, so you wake to new history every night. Because these beasts don't vanish when you close the book, they linger in the margins of your dreams. But the story doesn't end abruptly. You need a softer landing, a gentle glide into sleep. The candle fades to nothing, and the room softens into quiet. You're still carrying the echoes of strange creatures across your mind: the furry fish, the dueling snail, the dog-headed men, the unicorn that healed and killed, the rabbit with a sword, the owl whispering from shadows, and the cow that wasn't a cow at all. They drift together like a dream unraveling, each page closing one after the other. The laughter has slowed, the shock has softened, and what remains is a gentle rhythm, the pulse of history humming low. You realize these medieval animals weren't really about animals at all. They were about people, our fears, our pride, our desires, our need to wrap the unknown in stories. Monks bent over vellum, peasants whispering by fires, kings buying unicorn horns, all of them searching for meaning in creatures both real and imagined. That search, strange as it was, connects them to us. We too turn the ordinary into symbols, the familiar into myth, the unknown into explanation. Now the images drift further, fading like smoke into the night. The rabbit lowers its sword, the snail withdraws into its shell, The cow dragon curls up in the barn. Even the dragon folds its wings and sinks back into its cave. One by one, the beasts close their eyes, and the manuscript becomes silent once more. So let your own eyes close with them. The world of medieval imagination has spoken its lessons, sharp and strange, but now it rests, and you, too, can rest. Subscribe before you drift off, so you wake to new history every night. Sweet dreams, traveler.